The reception of this movie is kind of confounding to me. Acclaim seems to be utterly universal, even from people who seem to respond more to action and pop cinema. Now, maybe this just has to do with the impressive visuals or the medieval fantasy setting, but other than that, I'm completely unable to wrap my head around it, especially when the film isn't even very good. I guess we'll talk about my expectations, since I want my opinion to feel valid and not just like I'm being contrarian. I went into this expecting David Lowery's signature long-take style of filmmaking applied to a fun, action-adventure plot. About 30 minutes in, it became clear it wasn't going to be much of an action flick, and by the midpoint, I was starting to reevaluate it more as an art house tone piece. But even then, a couple things were not making sense to me. Art house films work best when their characters are indicative of the themes of the film. It's rare, borderline impossible, to craft a film that succeeds without any character development or compelling arcs. Throughout the entirety of The Green Knight, Lowery seems more focused on cinematography than on crafting a story. And sure, that is its most compelling aspect. I was never too bored because I could just sit in awe of how each shot was perfectly captured and lit, and then anticipate another masterpiece every time it cut. However, pretty shots can only be so compelling. At some point, I need a character or a theme to attach myself to, and the film fails in both departments. Dev Patel's character takes on his quest for no real reason. I suppose it's so he can prove himself as a knight, but I was never convinced that the character's desire for this outweighed his fear of death. The film tries to pretend like this isn't true, but without actually succeeding, it drains the character of his conviction and makes his arc feel unearned straight from the get. There had to be a scene where Gawain saw a knight or interacted with a knight and had a clear desire to want to live that kind of life. In Seven Samurai, it's very clear that Kikuchiyo wanted to become a samurai because he spends all of his time following them around and trying to prove himself. One scene like this in the Green Knight's opening was all I really needed, but without it, we lose an essential part of this character. His motivation is completely lost. All we know about him up to this scene is that he's a bit of a scoundrel who spends most of his time at a brothel. I think the opening scene of the film is actually very indicative of its overarching flaw. We open on a very long shot of a lowly animal coop with someone sleeping in the corner of the frame. It's very hard to make out who this is, so at first I thought this was our main character, and the shot was symbolic of the type of place that he begins the film in. As the shot progresses, we notice a burning building in the background, a story starting to be told. Then a swordsman is helped onto a horse by a woman, perhaps his wife, and then suddenly we pull back into the aforementioned brothel and find Gawain waking up after a night of debauchery, and the burning building is never mentioned again. We don't know what's going on with the animal coop. It was a waste of time. The entire opening shot has nothing to do with this story. Maybe there is some oblique reference to this world and medieval life that I didn't pick up on, but even if this is true, it's a jarring way to start off your movie. There's a lot of wasted celluloid here. Shots of nothing that go on and on, whose only saving grace is that they're absurdly pretty. Anyway, back to the character. In movies, character development comes in the form of a protagonist, antagonist, or otherwise, very simply, making a decision. As the film goes on, the character has to make riskier and riskier decisions until the end, where he has to make the riskiest of all. This is every great movie ever made, no matter how artsy or experimental. I think the only way to forego this is if your themes and motifs are pointed enough to get the audience invested in them instead. But very few films actually have themes or motifs that are that good, and believe me, The Green Knight is not one of them. The only decision that Gawain makes is at the very end of the movie, when he removes the enchanted sash. And it's a very powerful decision, indicative of the film's theme of honor. But this decision is not built up to at all. Gawain comes to the Green Knight the same character he was when he started out his quest, only to have the entire revelation that if he does not die honorably here, he will only die dishonorably in the future, in an arbitrary moment of self-reflection. Self-reflection that does not call back to things he learned along his path, but rather a hypothetical of his future prospects. If we had cut from Gawain riding away from the castle and straight to his encounter with the Green Knight, the film would be no different than what it is now. The themes of the prior sequences do not refer directly to Gawain's honor. Take the Joel Edgerton, Alicia Vikander snippet, for example. Gawain comes to this castle, and he is given food and rest for his journey. He's distrustful at first, but not without reason based on prior sequences and the urgency of his mission. Alicia Vikander's character seduces him and essentially rapes him in exchange for a magic, life-saving sash. The scene ends with her saying that he's no knight, implying that he is dishonorable. This isn't right. Gawain doesn't have time to react to what she's offering or doing before she's even done it. He makes no decision here. Maybe you could say he could have made the decision to tell her to stop, but I don't even know if he truly would have because he doesn't make the decision to go forward. Clearly, him obtaining the sash is a big deal since it could undercut the honor of the Green Knight's game. A better scene would have been Vikander's character trying to get Gawain to murder Edgerton for it. She clearly doesn't get along with the Edgerton character, and by the end of the sequence, we sure know why. So, facing Gawain with this decision would give him so much more clearly defined character. Does his life matter more than someone else's? This would be the ultimate test of his existential fears, which Lowry wants you to think he has because he showed his skeleton one time. Maybe Gawain doesn't go through with it and finds a way to steal the sash instead, which is a much more interesting concept for the sequence and more indicative of the character's inability to maintain his honor in difficult situations. Another scene where Gawain doesn't really make a decision is the one with the headless spirit lady. He's supposed to go retrieve her head, so slowly, ploddingly, that's what he does. The only hesitation he has is when he asks her, "What do I get in return?" To which she makes like a Marvel joke and says, "Why would you ever ask me that? Don't you ever ask me that?" Maybe if there were more than like 3 people in the theater, that would have gotten a laugh, but certainly didn't get one from me. Yeah, these are just the wrong scenes. There's a really compelling way to make this film, and Lowry didn't make it. I don't think, however, that any of this was unintentional. If you have a tolerance for incredibly oblique references and a preference for more visually led narratives, this should be right up your alley. But if you're like me and you dig a good script with good characters and forward progression, don't pretend you like this. I would have much preferred a 30-minute short film or just some actual character development to happen before the final scene. So, yeah, those are my thoughts. That's it. It's a bad time. Vodka required.
Crisis bomb. Crisis.